Hi class. I just wanted to make you a video on working on your COVID-19 self-portraits. I wanted to show you a bunch of examples. I've had some questions about things like drawing beards or hair or how you model this or how you model that. I'm going to show you first a couple of this is an early self-portrait when I was in my 20s. I wanted to get a chance to look at the way that I handle the cross-hatching, the way that I model it a little bit. See how rounded the eyes feel, how they're placed. It's not finished. It's in a sketchbook. You can see the side of the sketchbook. But it's an earlier version that I've always looked at as a very strong drawing and a big step for me as an artist. If you look carefully at the hair, you'll notice that I used a harder pencil to actually emboss my paper. And once my paper was embossed, I drew over the top of it with a darker pencil, and the darker pencil actually made the lines that were originally dark, put on the paper by the lighter pencil, appear very light. I used an eraser somewhat in this to kind of pull things up. If you look really carefully, I have found a number of highlights. Look at how rounded the eyes feel. You know, I treat them as eyeballs, literally. This, on the other hand, is a more recent self-portrait. Pull back for a second. Where I had a full beard. It's actually probably, you know, from a couple of years ago, I believe I did this one. It's in a sketchbook also, small sketchbook, not the most expensive paper. Take a look at the lips and how I handle the lips a little bit, how the upper lip is dark, the bottom lip is lit. See how the surface of the lip almost feels wet and moist, or how the eyes capture the light a little bit and reflect it. I mean, I really look long and hard and close in this. At this one, or how I model the cheeks by moving my cross-hatching around. So now I'd like to move over to a sheet that I've set up, which is a series of examples on how to start a head. If you look at the top left, I put the oval shape, but I also, around the oval shape, I dropped a rectangle, okay? Next to that, second phase, I try to identify the axis. When I start my self-portraits, I usually put a line across the top of the paper about an inch down and a line across the bottom of the paper about an inch up. That makes you kind of locate where the head's at, kind of sits you where you need to be, and then you move around it a little bit as you go. I also want to establish outside parameters and inside parameters. Right now, basically what I've given you is the shape of my head without thinking about any other ornament, which I would consider the ear an ornament in addition to it. If you look at the second one, instead of drawing that straight line down the center axis, I give it a little bit of a curve, all right? Because I'm thinking about the form, it's an oval. And actually a head is a double oval. It's an oval that is the face, and it's also an oval that goes back to the back of your skull. So that's a second look. So I have basically I have two axes, one vertical and one horizontal. The horizontal axis I put in the middle of the head. When we go over here and study this a little bit, I wrote some notes on it for you too. If you look, I basically broke the head down this way. From the top of the head, which is basically your scalp, to the bottom of your chin, all right? I called that one, all right? Okay? Then I split that in half. And at the halfway point, I kind of identify the halfway point at like the bottom of the eyebrows. You know, just where your eye sockets start. That's where I placed it in this one. So that's halfway down, and then the rest of it is down to your chin. So that's the split in the middle of the head. It's 50-50. From that split, from the top of the eyebrows down to the bottom of the chin, I cut that in half again, all right? And when I cut it in half, I almost want to get to basically the peak of the nose, the point of the nose where you kind of, like it kind of stands out the furthest. So that's the peak of the nose. I'm gonna get something here so I can start pointing at these things right here, okay? So from here to here is one. That's the halfway point, and the next halfway point would be at about the peak of the nose. That's the bottom of the nose there, middle of the lips, and then the base of the chin, okay? So I want to move over here a little bit where I have actually rendered a head. If you look carefully at it, there are important places to think. I want to go back here for a second. Like I set the eyes in, the inside point of each eye, okay, doesn't move. It stays constant, as does the outside edge of each eye. All right, so you want to put those in first. There's usually about an eye length between the two eyes. You know, some people have eyes that are closer together. Some people have eyes that are further apart. So think about that as you're starting your head. All right, so let's move over here now, where I've started to actually do some rendering. Now, one thing I did mention up here is your hair is like, depending on how thick your hair is, it can be like an inch or so above the top of your scalp. Okay, it grows out. The top of your head is not where your hair starts. Or it's where it starts, but it's not where it finishes. It wants to be north of that. Okay, so be aware to judge the hair's thickness. Here's a rendering of a head. I mean, there are important, things to consider as you look at it, like straight lines down from the edge of the eyes. Use it to measure where do your lips end in relationship to where they are in your eyes. Put a straight edge on it if you want, so you can kind of see where that takes place, so you know where it's at. You could also use a straight edge across the bottom of your nose. Look at it. Look at this sitter's lips. Upper lip is dark, bottom lip is light. There's a shadow underneath the bottom lip, which sets up the chin. The drawing itself is gestural. Okay, it was done very rapidly. I identified the center of the forehead here, which might carry a highlight. I've placed both the eyes inside their sockets. When you work on the ears, you want to think about the top of the ear, the bottom of the ear, the side of the ear on the outside, and the side of the ear on the inside. You want to think about what type of shape that would fit in. And it's going to be a really skinny rectangle if it's seen from the front. Here we have some other parts. Let's just take a quick look at these. That's an interesting one. That's a rendering of an eye with an eyelid over it. So you get a sense of what the eye shape actually is, and that part of the top of the eye is covered. All right, just a little bit of the pupil and the iris are covered. And the bottom kind of rests on the bottom of the lid. Check out how I've drawn the nose from the peak point, okay, back to where it attaches here. The nostril attaches here in the back. It's also sloped and sloped back, and the eyebrow moves up over the front of it. If you look here, I've actually identified how many different planes I have. I have a side plane, a frontal plane, and another side plane. I want to move over. I'm going to show you a few drawings now that I have. It's a model I drew a long time ago, but I had a question about how do you handle hair? You don't draw every single strand of the hair. What you want to do is you want to think about the mass of the hair, and you want to kind of break it down a little bit. If you look really carefully at places like this, I basically counted off like 4 or 5 spots where there were large areas of curl and mass, and they sat back in shadow. Once I got them back in shadow, I identified that if there's a shadow, there has to be a corresponding highlight somewhere. I went looking for that, and usually use that an eraser to help me find that. Also, that if you notice the difference in the size of the two hands, that's called foreshortening. Okay, that her left hand on the right side is a lot closer to me than her right hand. All right, so in terms of scale, if I want to project that on a 2-dimensional surface and make it appear 3-dimensional, I have to consider size. And so her left hand is going to be considerably larger than her right hand. This is another figure drawing I did using pen. All right, I just wanted to see how I handled things like the hair, scale, placement. I'm below her when I'm making this drawing. I'm sitting down, she's above me on a model stand. So I am looking up underneath her eyebrows, underneath her, inside the sockets of her eyes. So she's looking out in a different direction. When I did this drawing, one of the things I think was really important, what I tried to identify was eye placement. I looked for a highlight on the pupil. I identified that. Also identified a highlight in the middle of her nose, middle of her chin. I didn't touch the top of her forehead, okay, where it also is very well lit. So, and if you look at a lot of my hatching and my modeling, it goes in the direction of where the flesh falls, how things are. That little 2 or 3 wispy lines here indicates her hands are crossed and folded over her arms. This one's done in ink, faster, another figure drawing. You know, it's basically black, white, and a gray wash. And I use, you know, very little detail to describe it. The only place I use detail is in the shawl that she's wearing. You know, I indicate that in black. You look at her figure, I added a little bit of water to her body color, okay? But her head is tipped, so her head was in shadow, so it should be darker than the side of her body. Here's another one. This is a male figure. You know, letting the paper work a little bit. I don't want to turn this sideways, I'm just going to go this way with it. So, give you a little bit of a sense of how I would handle washes to indicate light and dark. And you don't really need a whole lot to convince me of three-dimensional volume. This is another head, which is kind of interesting. If you look at it, I treated it really geometrically. I mean, I wanted to stress the planes of this young man's face. If you look carefully at certain things that I've rendered, this is the edge of his face right there, that line. It's not straight, it's curved. Just like it's curved around the edge of the side of his face on the other side. Important places to measure are, what's the distance between the tip of his nose and his cheek? Where do you locate his cheekbone? If his cheekbone's here, it has to have a corresponding cheekbone on the other side. You know, that line wraps around and tells me where to place the bottom of his eyebrows. Here's the middle of his head. Okay, his forehead, the middle of his forehead, which travels down his nose, okay, down his lips, and down through his chin. Look at where I placed the top of his ear. You know, there's a relationship there. You know, also consider, he had his hair pulled back and tied, so he had a little bun behind it. It was parted over here, okay? And then this portion was actually in shadow. Okay, that's the front part of his forehead. The top of his head, where the light's coming down on from there, would actually be lit and would be lighter. There would be a highlight where there was a crease here. And also that part is very important to render that part and to realize that there's a highlight here and then the hair gets darker there. Another figure with a couple interesting little studies. You know, certain things that you have to think about, like look at the tip of the nose and look at the forehead and look at the tip of the lips. There's about an inch space between them. And then below it, I drew a head seen from above. So in other words, that's kind of explaining it almost as if we're talking about the orbit of two planets. And the one planet is the actual, the forehead, okay, as it wraps around that shape. And the second orbit would actually be the tip of the nose. So there'd be about an inch difference. It has to stick out from there. You know, he had braided his hair, so it's kind of interesting how I went about the issue of actually dealing with braided hair. I broke it down very simply first. You know, I counted things off. I make the relationship apparent so I can start to work things up as I go. In other words, once you get the generalization, you start to model each one. This is a figure with his head down. So there's actually a better drawing, a little darker underneath it. I'll go back to that one. These are just plaster casts we have in Middlesex County. If you look at that plaster cast, okay, it's a planar plaster cast. It basically wants to show you shifts in the plane as you move across a form. You know, and the lines don't actually exist in space. They're just there to kind of indicate where one's plane would go into another. That's the place where they intersect, and then it shifts down. So if you're putting in value, okay, something happens at that point where it would get lighter from the dark here as you go across, and that's how you would render things and make them as convincing as possible. A lot of my shading is directional, like I follow the form. Creases. I always say find your darks and your lights first whenever you start. Now, I've had some questions about how do you render hair? Well, that's just generally a general rendering of hair where I've done, it's very straight hair. But what I wanted you to see is how I'd start it and how I'd work it up from there. I'm using the eraser. I'm using a variety of pencils. Look at how this spot, okay, towards the forehead is darker. You've got the part here, which is important to render, okay? And once you get at the part, it's actually gonna sit in shadow on this side, sit in shadow on that side, and then it's gonna be lit over here. Don't try to draw every single strand of hair. Just try to indicate the direction they're going in, and then you sharpen your pencil and go back into it later. And you just start to basically fake it. You start to, once you have the indications of where they're going. Here's a beard that I rendered. It was my own beard. So, but I want you to see how I went about doing it. I put it in tonally first, and by tonally I mean, if you look down there, you'll see that I kind of blended a lot of middle tones, a lot of grays. And then I drew over the top of it and kind of curled my lines as I went. Darkest part of this drawing, part of the beard, and also the midpoint of the lips. Here's a couple charcoal ones that I did. Just really black and white. All it is direction and value. Okay, these were done in like 5 minutes just to show them how to render hair. Look at how much bigger her hair is than the shape of her head. It's about 1 inch taller. It also creases at a V where it's parted in here. Okay, and then I work the direction it's going in. Here's another one. This is a more complicated type of hair. It's really curly. So basically, if I was going to draw really curly hair, or I was going to paint really curly hair with, say, ink, I'd block it in first. And by that I mean general shapes or forms. Like this is one form here across the top of her head. This is another form here that falls to the side of her head. This is the edge of the hair where it might be sitting in shadow a little bit. This is the side in here where it might be sitting in shadow. There's another form here. So basically I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 forms that I render it in to start. The question was, how do I go about drawing a curl? Let me show you two drawings. One is open, and I'm thinking basically like a cylinder, okay, like a cylindrical shape. And what I did was I left these lines. Sorry about that. I left these lines in so you can see them. The curl's going to start bigger, okay, and it's going to get smaller as it exits usually. And what you have is it goes this way. The dots are the back part of the curl. The straight lines are the front part of the curl. And it's going to connect here, come back out, come back this way, come back out, come back this way, come back out. Okay, and I would erase these lines later. Those are just extra lines. Here's a finished version of it. And I haven't quite erased the lines out yet, but that gives you an idea of how that would actually kind of operate or how it would work. So I believe that's all I have. That is what I have here so far. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of help with starting your heads and thinking about it. Think light and dark. Don't be afraid of leaving some of the paper white. Think about how things project on the surface of the head. I always tell people, don't put your eyes in, put your sockets in first. In other words, deal with the sockets first. They're going to be shaded a little bit, and then you work your eyes out from there. So, well, good luck with this, and I hope to see good results next week.